I think you'll get something great out of today's presentation. So I'm going to go to the next one. I'll just introduce the panelists. We have Ashley Brucker from American Farmland Trust has done a lot of work with non-operating landowners and will kind of share the landowner perspective with us. We have Clay Bess with field manager for precision conservation management, has worked with a number of farmers in East Central Illinois. Steve Stierwalt is a Champaign County farmer. And many of us know Steve on his many other roles he plays in soil and water conservation districts and AI, SWCD, and STAR program. And then Corey Zellhart is the farm manager at Busey Bank. And Steve and Corey work together on their lease. And then we also have Gary Place, Champaign County farmer. And his landowner is Van Allison, who actually is not able to join us, but Gary will talk a little bit about his relationship with the landowner as well. So with that, the other people that are part of this conversation, of course, is the audience. And so what I want you to do is share a little bit, tell us who's on this call by using your annotation tool. And if you haven't done that yet, you can find it up near the top. There should be something where you can see that you're seeing my screen. And there should be a view options, and you can use annotation. You can turn that on, and then I want you to use a stamp. You can choose whatever. If you feel like a heart or an X or whatever, I want you to put your stamp by whichever of these describes you best. And we should be able to see, and you can choose more than one. If you're not sure which category you fit in, or if you fit in more than one category, feel free to add some stars there. Are they showing up? Oh, yep, there. I see. I have to move my computer screen just a touch to see where you all are. So if everybody's had a chance to do that, looks like this group, oh, a few more appearing there. A blue squiggly line for a researcher. That looks, I thought researchers would be very precise, but I don't know who that person is, but that's okay. I love the creativity. Looks like we've captured this. I mean, Alphabet Soup is certainly a group or network for professionals, so I'm not surprised to see the majority of agricultural professionals there. But we'll go ahead and just welcome everybody. This is good information so that the panelists can kind of reference tailor the discussion to you all. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that annotation if I can find that, and then we'll go to the next slide here. Oh, I can never find how to clear the annotation. Amy, can you do that? If you go up to the same thing, there should be a clear annotation. When I'm sharing my screen, I lose all that stuff, as I said before we started. Okay, here.
We should be good to go. I guess if people have comments too, feel free to use the comments area. We know this is supposed to be a networking session, so feel free to take advantage of that group chat. You want to discuss things too.
Okay, awesome. And so it looks like we have a clean slide there. You can see Ashley's slide for your, all right, perfect. So I'll just I'll turn it over to Ashley. She's gonna give us a quick overview of kind of the landowner perspective here. And just let me know when you want me to advance to the next slide.
Great, thank you, Jean. Everybody can hear me? Yes? Yeah, yes. Great. So again, I'm Ashley Brucker. I'm the Ohio Ag Stewardship Manager with American Farmland Trust. And like Jean said, I do a lot of work with women non-operating landowners and our Women for the Land Learning Circle model, which is something that has been around for a number of years with a number of different organizations, but we really utilize it to bring information about conservation and agriculture and soil health to women landowners. So I'm going to just do really quick a few slides about kind of our non-operating landowner survey that American Farmland Trust put out. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Jean. To clarify before we get started, the difference between non-operator landowners and what you may hear of as absentee landowners, when we do our research, we found that the majority of landowners actually live in very close proximity to the land that they rent out. So that's not to say that there aren't folks who own land in Illinois and live in California. There are a few of those, but the vast majority of our landowners do live within just a few miles of that land. They probably grew up on it. A lot of them still live in the home that they grew up in. And that's really important when you look at what their motivations are in choosing management practices, in choosing farmers, in investments, all of that. It really kind of comes back to something we call community harmony. And our women non-operating landowners really place a lot of importance on that. Another thing to note is that a lot of folks, I know my dad refers to his landlords and his landladies. You can use landlord. It's a gender neutral term for everybody. So feel free, no one will be offended if you say the word landlord when referring to your landowner. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So like I said, American Farmland Trust knew that there were a lot of non-operating landowners across the country. You can see on this map from 2017 kind of what that distribution is. You guys have a huge chunk in Illinois there. So we set out in 2018 to do a survey of all of these non-operating landowners to kind of increase our understanding of how they make decisions, what their perceived barriers are, and use that research for implementing conservation on those rented lands. Next slide. So here you see the Illinois results, and I don't know, Jean, if we sent that out to everybody ahead of time, but if you would like to see the results for the Illinois specific survey, you can go to farmland.org/Knowles survey. We did 11 different states, Illinois being one of them. In each state, we sent this survey to 1,500 non-operator landowners, both men and women. For Illinois, you guys had 384 replying, and we did send these to non-operator landowners and absentee. So those were specified in our results as far as how close they live to their land. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And I pulled out just a few of the really key findings that we had in this report that we can look at really quickly. One thing I like to point out is all the way at the end of this, you can see that a lot of them do not necessarily live on the land that they rent out, but they live within 20 miles. So that's usually in the same county, maybe in the same township. They live pretty close to that area, and a lot of them have past farming experience. Next slide. They don't own a lot of land. That's what this next one is showing. So a lot of them own about 120 acres, but they rent out the majority of it, most of it to crop production. And the last two key points here are that they've owned the land for decades. These are generational landowners. People are inheriting it and leaving it to the next generation. Next slide. So this is really important also. This is the relationship with the farmer. A lot of them know who they are leasing it to. It's through a verbal agreement and it's long-standing. But the thing I like to point out is that it is long-standing for 15 years in Illinois, but it's on an annual term. So even though they're renting from the same farmer for 15 years, they renew it year after year after year instead of having a long-term lease. And it's overwhelmingly majority have trust in their farmer to make good decisions, especially in relation to conservation. Next slide. So these are the conclusions from the Illinois survey. You can see here they have a really high level of trust in their farm operators. They're very willing to adapt leases to allow for conservation implementation. They're willing to incorporate conservation practices. They support management decisions to improve the soil and water health. And they want to keep their farmland as farmland. Most of them do not want it developed. They want to keep it in farming. Next slide. And that's all I have really quickly. I know we have questions later on, so I will leave it there.
Great, thanks, Ashley. So Ashley mentioned the Knowles survey. We will be sending out to everybody who registered a follow-up email, and we can include that as a resource there, as well as provide a link to other state surveys as well. I know Amy asked folks, or suggested to list your name, organization, and where you're based in the chat, just to kind of help get us primed for our conversation that's coming up. And I will ask you to keep doing that so we have a sense of who's on the call, but I'm also going to ask Clay Bess with PCM to give us a quick overview of how his work with farmers and kind of their perspectives on conservation and leasing.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jean. Yeah, so working with a PCM program, I'm covering East Central Illinois, and right now I'm working with 100 farmers. We'll be adding a few more dozen in my region within the next month. So I'm working with those farmers, those producers, to capture all their passes through the field, put their fields into our database, and then pair the actual agronomic data with economic data that Gary Schnitkey works on, who's on the call today. Pulling that economic data from FBFM to pair that with their passes through the field to promote conservation, to work with farmers to find out, first of all, how they compare to other farmers that are doing similar system or a different system, and then helping that farmer make those changes. And sometimes those changes have been met with comments about the landowner relationship that they have. Things such as 1-year lease, the farmer doesn't believe they're going to see the benefit of a change in conservation. So they're hesitant to adopt because they're not going to get a benefit out of it when the land might, or they might, right? But they might not be on the ground long enough. They're accepting that risk if they were to implement conservation. Another comment that's been very common is that they're trying to get as much as they can out of that piece of ground. Make as much money so they can pay for that cash rent without taking on any more risk than what they're already accepting. And then I've had 1 or 2 growers make comments about how they were even afraid that if they were to implement conservation and they were to benefit from that from a financial standpoint, which PCM data has seen is very possible, then that if the landowner catches wind of that, they might be asking for more on their cash rent, or might be shopping around. And that was the most troubling comment that I've ever heard. So that's, that this discussion here is very important to me, to help those farmers be able to have these conversations with their own landowners, which we've been fortunate to have as well. Got a couple of growers who are taking their PCM report to their landowner to sit down and have these conversations, to show them where the money goes into with conservation and their efforts, and how they can improve their bottom line. And even got a couple landowners who are now meeting with us as PCM specialists to have those discussions, look through the report, and figure out how to make this whole thing work.
Great. Thanks, Clay. Yeah, we have some questions, like Ashley indicated, and I said too, we'll have some questions for our entire panelists. We're just kind of get some introductions and overview now. So I'll introduce Steve, and I think everybody knows Steve, and I don't know Steve that well yet, but I know, Steve, that it might be hard for you to stick to like 4 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask you to try and just give us a quick overview of your operation, and then we'll hear from the farm manager, Corey.
Okay, thank you, Jean. As I say, Steve Stierwalt. I'm a farmer from Sonoras, Illinois, which southwest Champaign County. My genesis, I guess you'd say, with conservation goes all the way back to when I grew up on a tenant farm with a landowner who is the senior partner in a huge law firm out in New York City. And back when I was a kid, he had a goal for the farm of leaving the farm in better condition than when he got it, which was, you didn't hear that much at that time. So I'm 65 years old, so that's been 50 years or so ago. And it really got my interest in why someone who is, you know, at that level in their respective industry had that much interest in conservation. So that kind of has got me started on the path. And but listening to what Clay was talking about, when you start talking about conservation and whether it's with the farmer or the landowner, there's so few things that we as farmers and landowners can control. You know, we can't control the weather, we can't control the markets, and so our practices are so, you know, valuable to us because that's one of the few things that we can control. And every time that we as farmers or as conservationists ask farmers or landowners to make a change, we're introducing risk. And that's one thing that we farmers are very, you know, averse to is risk. We try all we can to, any chance we can to minimize that risk. And I guess what I found, I had an opportunity to work with even Corey's predecessor on the Hunt farm, and the Hunt farm was very open to the long term, and I think that is a real key, is looking at the long term. And so they're open to interested in what the long term was going to look like and taking care of the farm for the long term. So we've had a very productive relationship for a long time, and I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So yeah, we have Corey Zellhart. I think I'm saying his name correctly there, with Busey Bank, and Corey is the farm manager there. And oh, I have some slides from Corey, so let me get those pulled up, and then Corey, you can talk a little bit about give an overview of what a farm manager does. Are you guys seeing my slide there? All right. Okay, I'll turn it over to you, Corey.
All right, thanks a lot, Jean. I appreciate you having me here this afternoon. As Jean said, I'm Corey Zellhart. I'm a farm manager for Busey Ag Services out of Decatur, Illinois, which is in Macon County. I've been here with the bank since 2011. And if you want to move on to the next slide, a little bit of an overview, kind of what we do at Busey Ag Services. Three components really, what we do here in our office. The first and kind of our bread and butter is the farm management component, which involves managing farmland for absentee landowners for a variety of different reasons. Some landowners just like to have a little bit of a buffer between themselves and the tenant. There may be some close family relationships there, and it kind of takes the emotion out of this situation. Could be for a reason of having a non-farm background and a lack of experience and just needing some guidance, some peace of mind. There's also some family squabbles and things of that nature as well that we deal with also. But essentially what we do for our landowners is, take on that fiduciary responsibility of making sure that their farms are well cared for, well maintained, and at the end of the day, they're able to, benefit on their valuable investment as well from the income that farm generates. And so we write leases for our landowners based upon the agreed terms between themselves and their tenant. That can be a custom farming arrangement where the landowner pays for 100% of the crops, or the inputs, gets 100% of the crop, and then the tenant operator receives payment for their services based on a per acre rate. Then there's also a crop share arrangement where all of the income and expenses are split 50-50 down the middle. The landowner pays for 50% of the inputs and gets 50% of the crop, which we help them market. And then there's also the cash rent arrangement, which is becoming more and more common as we move forward in time, in which the operator pays a per acre rate to the landowner in exchange for the opportunity to farm that land for the year. And then the other components of our business, in addition to farm management, farm brokerage, we buy and sell farms for our clients. And then the appraisal component, we do have one state certified general appraiser on staff, and we keep him busy doing farmland appraisals. We have offices in Decatur, Leroy, Champaign, Shelbyville, and Edwardsville. There's a total of 9 farm managers here, and we manage about 100,000 acres at Busey. And our clients are actually located globally. We've got clients in California, Washington, D.C., New York, London, England, the Middle East, as well as here in Central Illinois. So a wide range of backgrounds and different experiences that we work with. So if you want to move on to the next slide. Here out of our Decatur office, we're responsible for about 45,000 acres, and I personally oversee 16,000 of those. The area that I cover includes Farmer City, which is in DeWitt County, all the way down to St. Clair County near St. Louis, and as far east as Newman, which is a little east of Tuscola. And also serve as a licensed real estate broker here. And what I would tell you is that, you know, every account that we work with is a little different. Like I mentioned, everybody's got a little bit of a different background. So the relationship that we have with our clients is extremely important as to how we approach each and individual account. And so the specific account that Steve and I work on is the Hunt Farm. And I began managing that farm as soon as I started with the bank in 2011. Steve and I guess, inherited one another. And to be honest with you, this is one of our longest tenured farms under management here at the bank. That family also owns some ground in Macon, Moultrie, and Douglas County. On that particular piece of land, which is about 350 acres, there's 10 separate beneficiaries, and they're scattered all over the United States. And that's a pretty common theme with a lot of our accounts that we work with. Part of, you know, our responsibility is trying to work through some of those challenges of having so many different landowners with different undivided interests in the land, and different goals and aspirations and thoughts on you know, what's important to them as it pertains to the farm. So with that, that's kind of an overview of what we do and kind of how Steve and I's relationship came to fruition, I guess.
Great. Thanks, Corey. So we have another farmer, Champaign County farmer Gary Place is with us. Maybe Gary, you can just, I know Van, your landowner, wasn't able to join us, but you can talk a little bit about your operation and the relationship, or maybe how you work out with your landowner, what terms you have in terms of land management.
Okay, well, Van came to me about 6 years ago when his tenant retired. And he asked me if I was interested in farming his ground, and he was very concerned about conservation. Matter of fact, the first conversation we had, he wanted to leave the farm fallow, rotate it so that part of the farm was in fallow every 7 years. And I said, well, I'm doing cover crops. I think we can accomplish your goals with cover crops and no-till. So I took him on a little bit of a farm tour, and he was very impressed with what we were doing with our cover crops and no-tilling into some radish rows that we planted with the soybean planter. So it's sort of developed from there. Prior to that, I've been in no-till for 30 years, cover crops on every acre for the last 6 years, starting our 7th year here pretty quickly with the fall after harvest. So I guess you can say I drank the Kool-Aid. The biggest thing you could do to promote this is have a field tour with soil pits. And that's what really opened my eyes many years ago, comparing conventionally tilled soil with cover crops and no-till, and it was just night and day difference. So it just made me think at the time, why isn't everybody doing this?
Great. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I'm glad you could join us today. So we have a few questions kind of prepared just to get the conversation started, and I'm gonna turn over to Amy to facilitate that. But I also just encourage everybody, we can kind of try to create some sort of connection and feeling like we're all in the room. If you have the ability to turn your camera on so we can see each other, that's great. And then also feel free to use the chat to add some questions for panelists, or general questions for any of them, or a specific panelist. You can type that in as well. So I'll let you take it away, Amy.
Yep. Thanks, Jean. This is always my favorite part, is when we get to ask questions, and really want this to be an interactive element as well. So Ashley, I'll start with you. What do you think is one of the biggest barriers from a landowner perspective to getting more conservation practices adopted?
Yeah, so we actually asked this question in the survey. So specific to Illinois, per the survey, it's actually the perceived farm economy. So that is saying that a lot of landowners don't feel like they should ask their farmer to invest in that extra cost of putting conservation in, or they're afraid of the cost it might cost them, or whatever the case may be, based on the farm economy. Anecdotally, in a lot of the women's learning circles that I do, and I recently just completed a project that was all about getting farmers and landowners to jointly implement conservation. A lot of it is just because no one asks about it. Typically, the landowner is interested in it and the farmer is interested in it. They've never talked to each other about it, and they both assume that the other one wouldn't be interested in changing the lease, or like was mentioned earlier, would be requesting more money for rent, or whatever the case may be. And there's just never been a conversation around it. So lack of communication is probably the #1 barrier, but per our survey, it's perceived farm economy.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm just curious too, I know we want this to be a discussion, but what situations has anybody else on the call run into that you think could help maybe spur those conversations between landowners and between farmers? So it's kind of like when you're thinking about something and everybody's like, oh, I should ask, but I shouldn't ask. Anybody on the call have any tips or any other perceptions on like how you can take care of addressing some of those barriers? Feel free to chime in.
Well, Amy, this is Steve. I think Ashley brings up a very important point, is that those of us who have had the opportunity to have a long-term lease, it's so easy just to do the same things over and over again. That's the easy button. That's the path of least resistance. But to your point, Ashley, ask the question. Bring it up. I think that is it seems simple, but that is the beginning of it, starting that conversation. So I think you had a very good point there. Just, bring it up.
Gary,
And a lot of times,
oh, go ahead.
Amy, this is
really
Gary.
quick.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would just task any farmers or anyone who is talking to farmers about this with that burden of responsibility of bringing it up, because a lot of your landowners might be intimidated by the terminology. They might be afraid that they're going to ask about the wrong thing, or they might be bothering you because you've got 1,000 other acres you need to get to and you don't want to talk about it. So I would put that out there for the farmers to be the ones to bring it up to your landowners if it's something you're interested in, because odds are, and the numbers show it, that your landowner is very much in favor of it. They just need to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, Gary, would you have any tips for farmers to get the conversation started, or if people are working with farmers, like how can they help encourage some of those discussions?
Well, I'm thinking back to the first conversation I had with a long-term landowner. His great-grandfather let my grandfather farm the land 82 years ago, and we've had it ever since. So it's just been passed down through the generations. And he's always maintained to farm it like it was my own. So I've done that, but when I brought up the fact that, hey, we're getting into cover crops, would you like to jump on the crazy train with me. And he said, boy, that's, I could tell he was a little bit intimidated with that. He wasn't really sure if we ought to jump into that or not. So I offered to tell him what my experience would be. I'd go ahead and do it the first year and see how we get along on my own ground and report back. So when I reported back, told him we had really good luck. I was really excited. And he said, well, what's this going to cost me? And I said, well, I'll do it. I'll just cover it myself. It's long-term lease and it's best for the ground. And as a good tenant, I offered to pay the full price of the cover crops so that he was out no expense. And at that point, he was very excited to jump in and go because he was going to get the benefits without really any of the expense.
Yeah, Gary, I think that's a great perspective. And I think sometimes I think it is sharing those benefits. And Corey and Steve, you guys both talked about risk and how can like conservation practices help mitigate risk, or is that another talking point that people can use? And then Gary Schnitkey, I'm curious too on your perspective as to how some of those lease addendums can help as well. So Corey and Steve, thoughts on how conservation practices can help mitigate risk, or maybe like how a farm manager might view those practices?
Well, we sit down, this is Corey, by the way. So we sit down with our operators every year, you know, a couple times a year and just kind of go over the crop plan and what specific things the farm may or may not need. And so I view an important part of our job is maintaining and improving the quality of the farm. So those are the types of discussions we have when we sit down in those meetings. What sort of things do we need to improve, or what sort of practices do we need to be undertaking here to make sure that we're not, you know, we're improving the quality of the farm, or we're not losing ground in terms of quality. And so those facilitate a lot of really good discussions with our tenants, and those discussions we then take back to our landowners, and you know, they more often than not are very receptive to what we come back and recommend to them. And so that's kind of you know, our approach to dealing with a lot of those types of things.
Well, Amy, risk is, you know, as you said, top of mind for me and a lot of other farmers. And whenever we talk to a farmer about, as conservationists, we talk to a farmer about making a change, just the word change makes them think risk. And so my suggestion is, as we're talking to farmers, you actually talk about what problems that they have. And a big problem right now is weeds that are resistant to herbicides and things like that. And so one way to help solve a problem like that is with a cover crop. And so you start, you know, kind of, in my opinion, you try to work down roads that show benefit to the potential landowner, or the farmer can show benefits. But I would caution people just about using the word change. Even that word really that causes us to be on alert as farmers. You know, anytime you're asking us to make a change, we need a good reason to make a change. So think about the reasons, and there we can find some success, I think.
Yeah, I thought Gary did a good point too, of just like asking questions like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, instead of like, let's implement a certain practice, because that, I think, just having that conversation can probably open some ideas as well. Clay, what are your thoughts on this? You mentioned some good examples of how you had some success with changing people's minds, but what do you think are other barriers, or like, what is your response to sort of Steve and Corey's thoughts as well?
Yeah, and I thought Ashley did a good job of summarizing both the landowner and the tenant's perspective. And I do think there's a lot of, well, since it's always been an issue, that landowner relationship, I think that even though it might not be, I mean, that's just an easy excuse to get out of talking about implementing something. And I think I've found that, and you know, PC, and we're using a lot of our data. That's what we rely on. As we're building trend lines, I'm able to show a farmer where they can make a change on a field and benefit from that on the bottom line. And I've noticed that, you know, as we build that data set to help them be more confident in implementing planting a cover crop, that those conversations change. And that's when they start to talk about going back to the landowner and having those conversations. I'm not being afraid to bring it up, because I mean, yeah, that's scary just thinking about it, right? I mean, if the landowner isn't fully on board, then they're probably going to be looking for a reason to say, hey, that cover crop don't look very good, or didn't get much growth out of that in the fall. And just thinking about hearing those comments from all of us as conservation minds and farmers here on this call, thinking about hearing those comments, that's one strike against you, and you don't have many strikes.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about data and how important that can be. Just curious, does anybody else have any other tips as to how you can have that conversation, or things that maybe would help with landowners?
This is Carrie from the Natural Land Institute. We have a couple of farms, and one of the things that we've worked with our farmers on for having them do conservation practices is providing incentives, and we have a very low lease rate to give them incentives to do conservation practices. And then for the first 3 years, we encourage them to try cover crops and no-till and conservation practices just on like maybe 30 acres or a small field out of the other field, so that they could experiment. And then we also did some cost sharing, and we hired a consultant to work with them the first 2 or 3 years on choosing the best cover crops, and, you know, helping them so that they could feel comfortable doing those practices. And now we're moving into, I mean, last year was difficult, and we also have to recognize up in northern Illinois it was very, very wet, and they just couldn't get their cover crops in. So sometimes, you know, it just doesn't work out how you plan things because of the nature of farming, right? So I think it's the really important thing is to have good communication with your farmers, and they're on my speed dial, and we talk all the time. And, you know, I ask them how they're doing, and and it's developed into personal relationships. So I think that's also really, really important, that that relationship building, so that you can talk about anything. And being a conservation organization, they've been amazing to work with, because they understand that we have committees and we do things a certain way. And so we've really engaged them, invited them to committees, invited them to do presentations, talked about their challenges, and what can we provide them in terms of incentives to help them do those practices.
Yeah, Carrie, thanks for sharing those examples. I really like the idea of doing like a pilot project. I think sometimes if you can get people to start with sort of a small program, then it can lead, you know, to bigger opportunities, especially if you can see what works well. Ashley, I know you need to hop off in about 5 minutes. Is there any like thoughts on that topic, or anything else that, you know, it's like you want this audience to make sure that they know, or lessons that you've learned from Ohio or some of your other work?
Not too much additional. I think I've already hit on the really important point, which is just to get out there and really have conversations with your landowners, with your farmers, whatever side you might be on. Carrie brought up a really good point just now in developing that relationship through pilot programs that you might have on a local level. Talk to your local SWCD or Nature Conservancy or whoever you have in your area to see what there might be available to offset that cost a little bit just to get started. I would also recommend take your landowners out and walk in the field with them when you have those conservation practices in place. Take them out in the tractor with you. Offer to take them along with you, because that's really going to help boost their confidence. It's going to help with your relationship, and it's just going to be better all around. I know that sounds like really hippy dippy, froofy, but It really does work. So it's something, since getting into this, that I made my father, who farms in Northwest Indiana, do with all of his landowners. And he now does, now that we are renting our land out, he does with his tenants. So it works. Just talk to each other, and you'll be amazed at how many things you have in common as far as how you want your land to be farmed.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I love that example of show and tell. I think sometimes there's like a lot of value. And I think, you know, Gary talked earlier about sort of those soil pits and just how much of a difference that can really show people. So thank you for joining us today. Gary and Schnitkey and Corey, can you talk a little bit more about like how farm lease terms affect the use of conservation practices, and, you know, if there's anything from, you know, like some of those written agreements that can be used to help spur conservation? So again, just a little bit more about the lease terms and how that can affect the use of conservation practices. You know, we know that Illinois has a lot of rented ground.
Well, my leases are mostly 50-50, and they're verbal except for one. The one that is written is a multiple year lease with conservation written into it as far as cover crops, no-till, all that's lined up. Everything else is with my other landlords. All those leases are verbal, and they just expect me to care for the land. I've talked to everyone about the cover crop situation. They're all on board now. Like I said, we've been doing it for 6 or 7 years on every acre. But like you say, communication is the key. You have to communicate with your landlords. I talk to them several times a year throughout the growing season. They get text messages or videos, so they see the cover crops growing. It's just, they're excited. I mean, it's if you're not involved with this, you may think, well, that seems a little crazy, but the landlords are genuinely excited about what's going on.
Yeah, Corey, Gary, Schnitkey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess speaking towards the types of agreements that we work with, all of our leases are 1-year leases, year to year. With that being said, almost all of our relationships with our tenants are long-term. I mean, some of these go back over 100 years. And so those relationships between the operator and the tenant for a lot of the accounts we work with are actually pretty solid. Meaning that even though our leases are 1 year, year to year, could be potentially restrictive to getting anything done. You know, we can structure them pretty flexibly to have some sort of a buyout if needed, but more often than not, you know, it's something that we can add very easily to any sort of year to year arrangement. It's a very flexible situation.
You know, just lease terms matter a lot, and I would just listening to this, Gary and Corey have lease terms that are conducive to conservation management, and their landowners care about that, and I would just mention that out there's a lot of leases that are cash leases year to year with pretty high cash rents. That matters in whether you're going to get conservation practices adopted on the farm. And I would also mention that we do have some conservation addendums on our FarmDoc website that was developed to help landowners and farmers think through what they want to do on that operation. And again, those lease addendums should be signed after you've had a lot of conversations and starting that. And I would also say, if we're thinking about what we want to do next year, we should begin to have those conversations now so that we can, I mean, we don't want to be springing things on people, and having a good conversation about what's going to happen on those farms is a very good thing.
Yeah, if anybody wants to see Gary's webinar from this morning, shameless plug, that it is on Illinois Advisor. or will be later on. So there's lots of good information there. Corey, I'm just curious, we know Steve likes to talk. Have you been able to use him to help convince anybody else or any other clients about conservation practices they should implement?
Yeah, so Steve has been a fantastic resource. What I would say is, all of our different arrangements and different accounts are completely different. All of our different landowners have different goals and objectives, and so there's not necessarily a real cookie cutter approach to how you approach these situations. It's about developing relationships and fostering those relationships over the years, which anytime you have a high quality tenant like Steve, he makes me look good to my clients and allows me to build some rapport there. And so I rely heavily on my high quality operators like Steve to be able to get these types of projects off the ground and running.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, I know a key part of Alphabet Soup is just sharing kind of what's going on, and want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time as well today. If anybody has any announcements or if you have any programs that are going on that you want to promote. So we'll open it up to the floor, and anybody can share things that they're working on, or if you have additional questions for the panelists. This is where I get to stop talking and everybody else gets to join in. We can pretend that we're all in like a space together like we usually are.
I got a question for Gary and Steve. What are you going to do cover crops next year? What's your plans right now?
Well, we're using a 4-way mix, typically oats, cereal rye, tillage radish, and buckwheat. And that's going to be flown on here probably in about 2 weeks. On about 280 acres of soybeans, we have a 2-4 bean planted early, and we will drill those in the same mix. We'll drill that in. Drill is the best way, obviously, to get the best seed to soil contact. But in order to get everything seeded by mid-September, we just have to rely on the airplane.
We're going to be using cereal rye following corn ahead of soybeans, and on our ahead of corn we use winter barley and buckwheat. Have pretty good luck with those combinations. The biggest problem we've had is trying to find something ahead of corn that doesn't compete with the corn, but yet gives us the benefits of living roots. And been just experimenting with winter barley now last year, and have preliminary results are good.
Steve, thanks for sharing that, and Gary, thanks. That was a good question that you asked. Anybody else have any announcements or questions or feedback on things that worked, not worked, things that you want to share?
Well, this is Carrie Lee again, and I just wanted to share that we used the addendums this year on our leases with our farmers. And every year we kind of sit down and go over the leases and talk about how their year went. So this is the first time we used those addendums. And the way I kind of framed it was that we were going to work on this together to see over the next few years how we could increase our practices. And they were very open and receptive, and we kind of went over and said, okay, well, we're already doing this, so let's put that in there. And then, so we kind of worked it together. We sat down together, and it was a really interesting process. And I wanted to thank you guys for putting those together. Thank you.
Thanks for the compliment. We're glad when we get those. So,
Amy, I'd like to give a little shout out to the Department of Ag. They are requiring everyone who takes cost share money from the Illinois Department of Ag this year to fill out a STAR form and to start basically getting a baseline on their conservation efforts. And so we all talk about how do you get conservation to move forward. Well, what Carrie just talked about and what the Department of Ag do, you know, we farmers need reasons. And those are good reasons to get started and start keeping track. You know, you might say keeping score. How are we doing on our conservation efforts?
Yeah, Gary, thanks for giving our friends at IDOA a good thank you there. They always appreciate it. We know that. So, is there any other announcements or feedback for the group?
I have a quick question. Is that STAR group just still in Central Illinois? That STAR program?
STAR now, there's, I think, Aaron, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think 78 counties now in Illinois. We have 3 counties in Indiana who have officially joined, and we're getting STAR forms now from a total 5 counties in Indiana. Iowa and Missouri have signed MOUs, and Iowa has theirs up and running for this year as a pilot. And Colorado and Nebraska are working their way through the process. So there's a lot of people interested in a way of kind of ranking how their farmers are doing, and for farmers to kind of see a path forward.
And just for people who are on the call, there's a position open right now for a STAR coordinator. So if you know any professionals or anybody who's looking for a position or looking to really help advance STAR, now's the time to step up and submit your application. I have a shameless plug for a workshop coming up on September 3rd. We're hosting a phosphorus management workshop. It's going to be a webinar, virtual again, and we have some presenters, Dr. Fabian Fernandez, now with Minnesota. I think he used to be with U of I here, and Dr. Nathan Nelson from Kansas State University, and Dr. Heidi Peterson. There's a lot of doctors on the panel. I'm a little nervous, all that PhD brain power, but we're going to be talking about phosphorus management, tillage, phosphorus placement, and also phosphorus cycling with cover crops. So I posted the link there to register for that. That'll also be under ISAP too.
Megan Baskerville, anything from your end that you want to share or talk about? You're sort of like one of our co-conspirators with Alphabet Soup.
Sorry, it's so hard to find the unmute button these days. But no, I really do appreciate this. I don't have any announcements per se, but I guess whenever we talk about owners and tenants, I keep going back to the fact that it seems like the real crux, or what it's really hard to get at, is motivating those landowners. It seems we know how to get the tenants to bring up different conservation practices with their owners if they want to, but to really affect, you know, we heard today from Gary that over 50% of our land is rented. It sounds like we've got to somehow get a cultural movement or something else to get those owners to speak up about these practices that they might not know about. So I still haven't hit on that yet, but programs like STAR, in my mind, as long as we can get simple stories or transfer this really complex issue to a simple story like STAR, that seems like it would be helpful, and it's really exciting to have that in Illinois.
Yeah, it's been fun to watch STAR evolve over time and really sort of gain some traction. Anyone else have any announcements or things that they want to share? Okay, if we're not seeing anything, if anybody has any ideas, we tried doing this virtually just to see how it would work. Alphabet Soup started many years ago at Commodity Classic, so it's great to see it continue. But if you have ideas for future meetings or future topics that you want us to discuss, you know, feel free to let Jean or Megan Baskerville or I know we're happy to integrate those in. So it would be kind of fun to do a virtual field day with people in different spots, but I don't know, maybe that's a next year project. And Gary, anything else from this morning's discussion that you want to share? Any other highlights?
Oh, I think what it is sort of interesting. We always hit that conservation or conversation is a key to conservation. So try
We might
and
be
say
working on
that.
something about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you know, and that and just there are resources to make those conversations happen, and I would put our lease addendums in that frame as well.
I would put them in there too. And after this, there will be an email sent out to everybody who had registered with some links to resources, as well as an evaluation poll, which I know is painful, but it's quick. So we do ask you to take a minute to just fill that out for us, and help show that we're making a difference here, and also providing some feedback on future events. And with that, I guess I'll just give another shout out and thank everybody. Thanks, Amy, for instigating this or initiating this, and Megan Baskerville as well, and myself kind of putting this together. And then our panelists today, Ashley, of course, who had to hop off already, but Clay, Corey, Steve, and Gary, and Gary, both Garys as well, just sharing your perspective today. Really appreciate it. It's great to have some farmer perspectives on this. We're all working with farmers, and it's great when we can actually hear from farmers directly on how we can better help and move this conversation forward. So unless anybody has anything else, we can thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you at the next Alphabet Soup or the next event before that.
Thanks, everyone.